can expect over the next 6 years. So Rob, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Rick. It's always great to get back over to this building and see all the great people who are here, and pleased to be able to give this research conference, which is really going to sort of be, I guess for me now, a typical thing. Don't pay attention to any detail that's in any of these slides because they're going to go by way too fast for you to pay attention to detail anyway. What I really want to do is to give you an impression as we're putting together our competitive renewal for the CTSA grant, and you'll hopefully through this get a good idea of how this is playing into the overall picture for the institution and maybe how it relates to other trends that are going on in other places and other institutions in other parts of the world. So what I'm going to cover today would be the background for the Translational Medicine Institute and our ongoing identity struggle, I guess I'll call it, where recent work we've done has shown that a lot of people don't know what the DTMI is, and we even have a lot of people on the undergraduate campus that just use the phrase DXXX to describe everything that goes on over here because of all the different initials that are involved. Give an update on the current status of DTMI mixed in with current thinking about future plans, and then just a little bit about how to think about one or two of the cross-cutting themes that may tie the whole picture together for you, and then one slide at the end on what you can do to help. And I'll try to get through this quickly so that we can have some time for discussion. As you all, I'm sure know, the genesis of DTMI and the CTSA grant was a frustration that many of us have had that we have all this tremendous biomedical science going on at our academic medical centers, particularly in the U.S., and we have great difficulty getting things out of the lab and into even the beginning of human studies. But even after we've done that, if we have successful studies, we have a really bad record. And I have to be careful now. I just came from a meeting where there was a vivid discussion about the risks of telling people that they're bad at what they do. But let's just say the U.S. is not considered by the rest of the world to be the great health system that many of our politicians claim that it is, because the health of our population doesn't look all too good compared to most other people from economically advanced countries, and even previously economically deprived countries are making great strides relative to the United States in terms of health status. And so the response to this after several iterations at the level at the NIH under the previous director, Elias Zerhouni, was the CTSA grant. And at a meeting yesterday of academic medical center leaders, I was reminded that this was initially going to be a $700 million a year program. But after a tremendous uproar by the basic science community, it was cut to $500 million a year. Still a lot of money by any standard, and a national effort to resuscitate translation and clinical research in the United States. And this program has now been moving along for a while. We were in, as I think all of you know, we were in the first group of institutions to be funded now about 3.5 years ago. And these are the general goals of the program on a national basis. Nothing too surprising here. We're now up to 46 institutions and 3 affiliated minority institutions. And you can see we've got most of the U.S. covered except the swath of states up in the upper Northwest. But the dirty little secret here, of course, is that University of Washington actually has a consortium that works together. So the little dot up there in Washington actually represents most of the surrounding states. And when people ask why on earth would they do that, the answer is very simple. 6 states equals 12 senators. And if you got 12 senators voting for anything that you do pretty well. So it's been a very effective consortium. And you can see that the Southeast is very well represented now in this consortium. I had the privilege of being the co-chair of the steering committee when we first formed, and did that for 2 years. And at the culmination of my time, we came up with this general vision statement. And it really represents an evolution of the project overall. As I think you know, every academic center in the U.S. had major difficulties that had to be overcome with the money from the grant. This was a huge effort and exhausting for most of the PIs. In fact, I spent a good bit of my time as co-chair in the first several years having PI-only phone calls with no NIH people allowed because the burnout rate was so high among the PIs and the frustration level trying to change academic centers. But now we're evolving to the point where people have the energy to think that we can do something as a consortium, that there can be a national effort. And as I finish my term, Deborah Roth is now the co-chair of the administrators committee for the group and is carrying the torch through this effort. And in order to get anything done as a national consortium, you have to focus on a few things that you think you can accomplish. And these are the 5 really focused goals that we have. And you'll not be surprised, largely due to Deborah and Becky Mullen's effort, the entire consortium is now switching into a project management mode to deal with these issues, where instead of just having nice meetings where we chat on the phone, people take minutes, there are deliverables that are part of the effort, and I think the consortium is now on an upswing. But you can see, this is worth spending just a minute on. The number one priority I think everyone agrees to, and this is greatly reinforced yesterday as we were talking about patient advocacy groups. If you ask patient advocacy groups what do they think academic medical centers are not doing, the number one thing that they mention over and over is they're not enrolling people in clinical trials and doing it efficiently, and it takes forever to get the answers about the diseases that they have. So building this capability through gradually getting over the hump so that we can measure what we do and increase efficiency is the number one goal. The second is, and everyone agrees is critical, is the training and career development. Without a pipeline of people who know what they're doing, of course, we have no future. The third really has to do more with the informatics of trying to make more resources available across institutions to multiple people. And that's a pretty difficult challenge, even within an institution, as I'll talk about in a minute. It's amazingly difficult. The fourth is one that's really gotten legs now with the new administration, and Lloyd Michener has been a real national leader in this regard, is really not just talking about how many research projects are we doing, but now beginning to talk about, are we changing the health of the populations that we're involved with. And then one we added after the original strategic plan, and I'll talk a bit more about this, is there's a real concern right now that people who operate at the interface of bench research and bedside research are having great difficulties throughout academic medicine because of the pressures that exist on the financial side and the efficiency side of both of those equations. So a simplified structural plan looks like this altogether. There's something like 3,000 people working on various committees representing the 46 institutions. A simple way maybe to describe the challenge of administering this thing, it's as if you have a national corporation that has 46 affiliates, none of whose primary allegiance is to the corporation, and all of whom have other bosses that they have to respond to, and you're trying to get them to do something together. It's really quite a complex challenge. Now, getting back to our original application, we started our application with this statement from Dick Broadhead when he originally came here as president of the university and made his rounds. This was actually delivered at his inaugural address, and I think it really captured an advantage that we have over most other academic institutions, and that this place is full of people who are not satisfied with a purely intellectual component of their lives. They want to see that what they're doing is being translated into something that makes a difference for other people. And I won't say that's true of 100% of people here at Duke. We do have our radically academic fringe that lives in a totally theoretical world. But I think relative to most places, we have a lot more interest in practical application. And so we started out with 4 specific aims, and right away you get to this problem that I've been suffering from the last few years, which is that when you talk about administration and infrastructure, it's hard to find anything really exciting, because you're really talking about the things that hold projects together. The exciting things are curing cancer or solving a specific problem. But the argument is that without these sorts of efforts, with firm goals in mind, and with measuring yourself relative to how you're doing on these goals, it's going to be very hard for specific projects to get done in this very much more complex scientific environment. So the first aim was to really get people at Duke to think differently about how we do translational and clinical research. We're 3.5 years into it now. The second was to fortify and strengthen our educational programs at all levels. The third was to develop better collaboration among the various departments, institutes, and centers. And the fourth is to develop a community model. And if I were judging us, I'd give us about a C+ at this point, but I think relative to everybody else, we're probably in the A category. So I don't know what that says about what league we're playing in. Maybe after last night, I can't resist saying this, maybe after last night the leagues have shifted around a bit, watching Bobby Crimmins beat Roy Williams. That was a real thrill. But now we have a new NIH director who comes along just at the time when we have to come up for a competitive renewal, Francis Collins. And as a lot of you know, Francis is a person who started out at the UNC School of Medicine in the early part of his career, developed a real reputation as a fundamental laboratory scientist, and then became the captain of the biggest team science project in the history of U.S. medicine, the Human Genome Project. And he just put out a statement in Science, the journal Science, at the beginning of 2010, sort of laying out what he saw as important. And you'll note here, if you're at the DCRI in particular, that he's really emphasizing the kinds of things that you've been doing for many years. And in addition, he's laid out some priorities for the NIH, and this is really fantastic for us because it plays right into the things that we think are important and have talked about. Applying new technologies to understand biology and causes of disease, translational research in general, putting science to work for healthcare reform, which is, I like that phrase a lot, global health, and empowering the research community by supporting investigators in different ways. So this is seeking a fairly broad reorientation of at least the cutting edge of what's considered important by the NIH. I think the bulk of the NIH will remain much like it is now, R01 based on mechanistic research. I don't see that changing, but if you look at the direction of the fungible dollars that are going to be moved around, it's been clear repetitively in lectures that he's given and articles that he's written that this is the direction that he wants to take it. For many of us, seeing global health in here was a really significant change because it was actually forbidden in the last round of NIH to talk about spending U.S. dollars on global health issues, with the exception of some practical applications for AIDS in Africa, which were pretty significant, but left out a lot of other things. So we got a new RFA for this competitive renewal, and it actually looks a bit different than what we were told to do in the first round. And this is to give you an idea of what we're responding to. Number one is providing resources for original research on novel methods. Number two, develop the technologies and knowledge base for the spectrum of science. Number three, fostering collaboration, kind of interesting. Number four, and this is a big one in this RFA, partnerships with industry, foundations, and community physicians. So a heavy emphasis now, not just on changing what you do internally, but developing outside partnerships. Number five is the old research and education part, and I'll say more about that. Number six, a very heavy emphasis on informatics and community engagement. A lot of self-evaluation. Not my favorite thing, but there's a lot of it in here. And then participating in a national evaluation. And again, if you want to talk about a challenge, trying to get people to agree on how you would evaluate the national consortium. I still actually haven't seen anything terribly cogent that's come out of the evaluation discussions, but I'm sure it will. And then project management made its way in here, defining milestones and providing timelines for reaching them. Within this, there are required functions that every institution will have to have, and it's interesting that informatics is number one. The career development is number two, and community engagement is number three. That order is very different than what was in the original RFP. And you'll notice that the other three that made the mandatory line are maybe different than what people might have expected to be there. I'll just mention it now and I'll mention it again. One of the great successes, I think, of the whole CTSA effort is something that we all knew anyway, but we don't talk about very often, which is to leverage the kinds of faculty who choose to make academic medicine a career. You don't have to put a lot of money out there. If you say we want to do something and you put a little money out there, it's almost frightening how many people will respond with creative projects. And so the pilot projects have been tremendously successful. We've had a successful version that I'll talk about in a minute. But for example, at Harvard, I think they thought they were going to get 80 or 90 applications for their pilot projects. They got 470 or something like that, some amazing number with projects at the $50,000 to $100,000 kind of range. So a little bit of money goes a long way. And then there are optional things that used to be required. Novel methodologies, research design, epidemiology, biostatistics, and ethics. Most of us never understood why these were all put together into one category, but they were. And one of the interesting sidelights that Dave DeMetz talked about in his lecture he gave here was the biostatisticians did not take kindly to being relegated to optional. So they raised an official fuss with the help of several of us PIs, and they've gotten a special announcement addendum to the effort, essentially saying biostatistics is not an optional component of your CTSA. What was probably most interesting and surprising was that the old GCRC equivalent, the intensive inpatient studies unit, is no longer required. It's now optional. And that doesn't, as I'll talk about, that really doesn't matter to us. We're going to do all of this because we're well down the road in every component, and we think they're all important. You'll also notice 25 single-space pages on governance at the institutional level. That's going to be a lot of fun to write and get everybody to sign off on. As you know, most academic institutions, I believe, really exist because no one actually really knows who's in charge most of the time. And the thing you don't want to do is to put it down on paper because that forces confrontations you'd rather not have. But we'll be dealing with it. And you'll notice the other things here that are emphasized, including one statement that says the binding is not in quotation marks in the statement. It says institutional commitments are binding, which is sort of an interesting issue for projects for grants of this magnitude, because obviously you can't control things like the size of your endowment or the national or state local economy. So it'll be interesting to see how we deal with that. So let's back up for a minute. What I'm urging everyone to do now in this application, which is due June 1st, and now really reinforced by the application, is to say, start out by forgetting the local environment in which you work. Thinking about your part of this grant or your part of the enterprise, back all the way up and say, if you're looking at the whole institution, what's happening with regard to this field or this area for the institution as a whole? And then from there, work your way down to what the CTSA grant specifically pays for, but realize that the intent of the grant is to say we need an institutional plan for the entire enterprise, and it needs to be written on paper and get people to agree to it. Then we can go out and do it. So if we just took the School of Medicine as one example, you'll see that there are almost 2,000 regular rank faculty, that is people who are either in the tenure track or on a full-time faculty status. There are over $500 million in direct research funding with $138 million in indirect, 4,600 grants and contracts, and about $400 million of this coming from the NIH. And then the other part is, altogether in the School of Medicine, this is a quote from Nancy Andrews yesterday, there's a total of 60 departments, centers, and institutes. So it's a little daunting to think about how do you back up and say we're going to look at the whole institution and make any sense out of it, since it's existed with totally unplanned chaos as a means of existence up until now. So in many discussions over the last couple of months, we come up with some specific aims, which again are not specific, but they should tip you off into the general way that we're thinking. And this has been discussed at almost every level. So and the way I'm describing another part of this is, in the first round of funding, we were consumed with trying to make fundamental changes in the main part of the biomedical research enterprise in the institution. And we're nowhere near finished. A lot of it's in midstream, since we're only 3.5 years into the grant. But now we're talking about the larger institutions. So we have to think well beyond the schools of medicine and nursing about the other schools. And in fact, we have many collaborations, either funded or partly using CTSA people with all of these elements already. But the real key here, and I think a real challenge, and a big challenge for our DCRI leadership, which has by design been a bit cordoned off from the rest of this up until now, is how do you create a situation where it's really win-win? Is this a battle between parts of the university or parts of the School of Medicine to see who gets the resources versus who doesn't? Or can we create a set of scenarios where everybody comes out ahead through collaboration? Many people have told me attempting to do the latter, coming out ahead through collaboration, is a recipe for getting fired, but we'll see how it comes out. Specific aim 2, which we're going to be talking about at our DTMI board meeting this afternoon a bit, really plays into where healthcare reform is headed. And it's good to have the NIH saying this is really important. But our goal is to take what we've learned, and both in the health system and in the Durham Health Innovations Project that we'll talk about, and really try to make substantial steps towards these two sort of phrases, which are really very meaningful. The first is a learning health system. That is where it's taken for granted as a matter of doing business that when you see patients in the Duke Health system, that the information will be double use, obviously for patient care, but also to provide knowledge through mining the information and making sense of it. And the second is accountability, and I still prefer the Institute of Medicine definition of accountability, which is measurable performance with consequences. So accountability means that you're measuring what you're doing, and if what you're doing is not measuring up, that you're going to change what you're doing in order to try to get better. Specific aim 3 is to show that the pieces and parts do come together in a coherent way. Right now we have 3 main candidates that I think almost everyone has agreed upon as good candidates for this. Saying you're going to do personalized medicine is almost trivial at this point to say it, but actually mapping out all the components and how it's going to be done I think will be a fascinating challenge. And the way I like to say it is it's really stratified medicine, because we use biology to pick groups of people who respond differently to treatment. The personalization part is actually not the biological part, it's the preference part, where we have tremendous strength in understanding how people make decisions, but we haven't used it too much yet in terms of our research portfolio. We'll talk a bit more about cellular and regenerative therapy, but this is something which I think is going to be enormous over the next 5 to 10 years, and we're in a great position in this building actually as global leaders in this effort, and there's new money coming in from philanthropists to help us do this. And then I'm not going to talk about RNA therapeutics, mostly because I don't understand it too well right now, but we have between here and UNC probably the largest, most talented group of RNA therapeutics basic scientists, And there's a tremendous opportunity here, I think, to lead the way in this new area of therapeutics. Specific aim 4 is all about intellectual activity. And the key thing here is we're obviously doing well and better than almost anyone that I know of in terms of bread and butter clinical research training. We've had a program for over 20 years. The statistics are amazing, really, for the proportion of people who end up in academic careers and go on and do great things and their satisfaction with the program. But the real key here is getting into a role in which we begin to think about globalization of knowledge and also lifelong learning as themes. And then aim 5 is about informatics. And it's critical that we gather the momentum that we've had. You're all aware that we started a new Center for Informatics that's unique, as far as I know, in that it's actually housed in our School of Business and our institutional information systems group, led by Ed Hammond, but brings together medicine, nursing, business, and soon School of the Environment and the School of Engineering, to produce people who can really make a difference in pragmatic informatics. And so this is going to be really focused, and it's an area where a lot of work is yet to be done, but where I think the biggest difference can be made. Many of you probably know what I have to always say when I talk about this, and I was just meeting with Carl Bates, who does a lot of our medical writing on the campus side, and I asked him, have you figured out how to make informatics sound exciting to regular people? And I'm sad to have to tell you that he said, no, I still haven't figured it out. So I actually think a major part of this is going to be continuing to work on how to make informatics sound exciting to people who don't understand it. Because all the rest of the pieces, I think, are actually fairly easy. The two hard pieces are going to be informatics and politics. The technical parts of these things have gotten easier and easier, and they're totally within our reach. And you'll notice here we're talking about everything from how we communicate to pragmatic applications of informatics to pure informatics research, all of which we have substantial strength in on campus, but it could get a lot better with our help and support. And so, as some people in the room know, under the tough taskmastering of Becky Moen and with the backup of Deborah Roth, we demanded that people turn in written versions 5 months ahead of time of what they plan to do. And I'm pleased to say that we either have a written version or an outline of almost every component. Now, as I look across these are the themes that come out, which sort of cut across a way of thinking about what we do. First is that we're in a new construct for academic medicine. I'll say more about this in just a minute. Second is that our institutional responsibility is not to pick one area or another. It's to say, what kinds of academic researchers are we going to support? And if we're going to support them, what are the specific things that we're going to do for that type of researcher to increase the probability that they will be successful? And I think we've actually done it. I think we've got everybody covered now. Not that we're doing it well, but at least we have a plan now. And I think the DCRI was a great example of doing this, and still is, for the clinical trialists, the outcomes researcher kinds of people. But there are many other kinds of researchers on campus who don't have access, for example, to a business development group that can write proposals the way our group can, and many other amenities that are here at the DCRI. It may seem odd that you would, and it certainly would seem odd to business that you would talk about an enabling infrastructure, but I can assure you that if you polled the 4,000 to 5,000 faculty members at CTSA organizations and asked the question, do you believe the infrastructure at your institution is intended to improve or help you do your research, or do you believe it's intended to make it harder to do your research? The majority would say harder. And I don't know how the poll will come out here, but it's on another slide, but I'll just mention it here. I was amazed at the tenacity of our faculty, because we had a group that put together a questionnaire for translation and clinical research faculty It took 30 minutes to complete the thing when I took it myself. Many people, including me, predicted almost no one would fill it out, but we had over 900 faculty who persevered and actually finished the darn things. And we haven't analyzed it yet, so we'll see exactly what they think. Hopefully they won't all have written extensive paragraphs about how ridiculously long the questionnaire was. And then this concept of the project as the fundamental unit of work. I think it was startling to many of us as we interacted with the other institutions, to see how few institutions think about research in this manner. And I'll say more about it in a minute. So it's a real fundamental element of everything that we're doing. And then this one is really, it's really sort of a curse and a blessing, because we are, relative to most institutions, in a position where we have influence and effects at every level. I just got an email from Mitch today, in fact, announcing that he's the co-chair of the major FDA collaboration with the regulatory authorities in Japan, which, if you want to have influence, being at that level is just fantastic. But we tend to sometimes forget our local responsibilities because we're so focused on all the rest, and it's balancing all those that needs to come through in the application. Constant measurement and improvement, public-private partnership, and then this lifelong education thing, which is, I think, a dream a lot of us have. We've all talked about it for years. It's really not happening that much right now, but we have ideas and plans for how it might. So this is from an article that just came out in Lancet that is at least the Duke leadership depiction of how academics in the U.S. have changed. And we had a fascinating discussion yesterday about this at a meeting of academic leaders, as I said, where we were discussing patient advocacy groups. So in addition to saying that we're not accountable, we're slow, we're inefficient, and we're too expensive, the other thing that they said loud and clear was they don't really see academic institutions as the places to go to get patients for clinical trials anyway. They want to go to the community. What arose out of that discussion as we went around the table was that if you look at communities now, who is it that the medical practices at least are working for? And this has been a major transformation of American medicine that very little has been said about. We started out with the academic medical center, which was a building like Duke Hospital with a medical school attached to it. We then developed the academic medical center and the health system that might have been owned by the same entity, but were really not connected very much, and there was a lot of schizophrenia about how connected it would be. But we're now not different than most other major academic medical centers in that we're part of a health system which is increasingly becoming integrated. And so if you looked at primary care, for example, in the state of Maryland, it's now about 90% either practices owned or having long-standing contracts with either Hopkins or University of Maryland. If you look at North Carolina, I don't need to tell you this, but it's sort of like the ACC. You got Duke, UNC, Wake Forest, East Carolina. Then you got Carolinas, which is going to have a medical school eventually. And that's really the way healthcare is breaking down in the U.S. So the old thing about the ivory tower, whether everybody likes it or not, is pretty much going by the wayside, and we got to think differently to deal with it. And in this article, you'll see that DTMI is depicted as one of the key integrators of that system as a whole. And particularly as we think about delivering things to society that it needs, it would be hard to describe what we currently have now as a system. It's a lot of different things that happen for reasons that are mostly historical, where things bounce around from one kind of entity to another. But the hope that many of us have is that as academic centers get more organized, they won't control all these things, but by having all the pieces and parts in one place, can serve as system integrators. So this is a reason to back up and think about what we're doing as a system. So I think as all of you know, we started out by saying we were instructed in the first round to create a home for clinical and translational medicine. So we took it literally and created a picture of a home. We're now up to 5 pillars with the recent addition of the Translational Nursing Institute. And our supporting structures have gotten stronger and stronger. In fact, I would say at least as much energy has gone into the supporting structures as it has into the pillars themselves, because these are people and talents that need to cut across all these different areas to enable them to be functional. So I'm going to quickly go through these and not spend enough time to get into any detail on any particular one. We've adopted this mission statement, and this has to do again with the fact that if we're system integrators, we're not going to own most of what we do. And what we've got to do is to provide a catalytic force that helps people get done what they need to get done by working together in research teams. And we're flanked on one side by scientific discovery, which is a huge part of the institution, and on the other side by an increasingly effective, and I think probably in terms of amount of time it's been in place, probably the most effective addition in the history of Duke. That is the Global Health Institute, which has really been a pleasure to work with and is making great strides. So then if we look at this and we say, well, what about DTRI? It's sort of arose out of something that previously had been totally run as a independent investigator kind of environment with a few core facilities. And with Bruce Sullinger as the faculty leader, Vicki Christian as the operations leader, and many, many people, there are a host of things that have been accomplished. And I actually think the crowning achievement is that they got 900 people to fill out this darn questionnaire. Because that gives you a sense that the faculty feel like something is happening here, otherwise they wouldn't have taken the trouble to fill this thing out. The pilot projects, as I said, have been extremely successful. The thing I think we've done differently than most of the other places is really treat the pilots as projects that have project teams, borrowing a bit from the industry that you all know so well, and also paying a lot of attention to follow-on funding and activity. And the track record, I think, looks outstanding. To get these pilot projects, by and large, you've had to have a talented bench investigator and a talented clinical investigator working together. And a lot of people have been working together who otherwise would not have been because of these projects, with a lot of success. And we're working with a lot of new methodology. I'll just mention one that you might enjoy watching. Radiochemistry, we have a couple of really good people in radiochemistry, but it was not an institutional strength in terms of infrastructure. Because of the Murdoch project in Kannapolis, the idea came up of building the equivalent of what's in France, which would be essentially the only facility on the continent, in fact, in all of the Americas, that could produce really high-level radiochemicals that could be used. It's a $70 to $80 million project, and it was very favorably reviewed in the facilities review, and has a good chance of getting funded and off the ground. But we'll know about that in the very near future. If that happens, it's going to be a magnet, because there won't be anywhere else in the Americas where you can get the kind of technologies that are going to be produced here. I could talk about a lot of other things, but I want, in the interest of time, just a quick update on the Murdoch project. We're over 2,000 people enrolled now in Kannapolis. Because of the downturn of the economy, we've had to slow things down compared to what we projected, but the project is really working well. And that first wave has produced a number of discoveries and papers and manuscripts, so it's been very successful. And then this is, you probably would guess this is Vicki's slide, not mine, but I think the plans for the future are to really have now an ongoing systematic approach where there's constant assessment of what people need. There's the development of new things that are needed, but also as things are developed and they become mature, having them sort of spin out and have lives of their own. And I think one of the great successes of this effort has been, in the past, it was a little touchy at times with the School of Medicine, as many of you probably know, but there's been a great collaboration now developed with Sally Kornbluth in particular, who's in charge of sort of the T1 School of Medicine aspects, and we're working together very successfully to make these things work. The DCRU is a hot topic right now because I think February 1st ever, we're going to have the grand opening of the DCRU. Not because it hasn't already been completed, but they can't find a time when McCutcheon and I are in town between now and February 1st. But this, I think, is really gathering steam. Danny Benjamin has been very helpful on the pediatric side after a lot of negotiation and all kinds of statements he was making about probabilities and gambling and things like that. But we also just got back from Delhi, and I can say now that it's for sure that we're going to have this 3-unit system and maybe even more, including Brazil and Eastern Europe as things evolve. And everybody I talk to, when I say, if we could do intensive human studies in small populations that are represent all the major gene pools, and maybe Japan now with Mitch and John Alexander here in the room, and you could do them simultaneously, is this something that you'd be interested in from the industry perspective? The answer has been extremely positive. We'll be testing it out in the next few months as to whether people are willing to invest in it and put projects into this system. And just to give you a feel for the fact this is real, without the excellent project management of me and others, you can see up here on the upper right, the Indian facility would have never gotten done. But I can tell you, it's amazing. We were just there a few weeks ago. This facility at the lower right is a 1,400-bed hospital that's just opened up the first few hundred beds, and within a few days was completely full to capacity and is about a half a generation ahead of us in terms of technology. We could have a long discussion about the dissonance of all the things in a country like India, but we need to understand that we need to work at all angles with global partners to be successful. We're not building the Taj Mahal. I just wanted to emphasize that, but it's fascinating to work in these different countries. So what's the goal here? The goal would be to say we take people, we understand their systems biology, we apply interventions that are carefully planned out using a very modern staff training model. We have a toolbox of genomic technologies and other methods that can allow us to characterize things. Hopefully advanced imaging, which will not be Duke's strength at least in the next year or two, and may be done better at other institutions. And we use the great bioinformatics, which is developing to look at patterns in ways that we couldn't before. And the hope is that we'll have signatures of response that will really sort of redefine the way we think about pharmacology. As most of you know, it used to be you took a new drug and you'd put it into people, you'd measure the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and create a profile, and then you go on from there. But with these kinds of methods, we're hoping we can develop ways of looking at off-target toxicities, likelihood of response in different segments of the population. The poster child for this project is actually the amazing topic of what's the right dose of aspirin. And as you've already heard, 100 years later, we still don't know the right dose of aspirin. Jeff Ginsburg has a GO grant funded, and we're hoping that we'll be launching this in Singapore in addition to in Durham, and then eventually in India to look at response to aspirin in terms of gene expression profiling. And so the goals of the DCRU in this next phase are going to be these kind of things which follow on from what I've shown you. I call a special attention here to the fact that I hope we'll have the guts to tackle the things that other people aren't tackling. Danny's already shown, and with tremendous work together with Jennifer Lee, that when we really got into the core issue of do we know what we're doing with our children when we treat them with drugs, that the answer is no. There's still more work to be done than the work that's been done so far. But you know, the next frontier is the fetal-maternal duo, where we know that pregnant women are using a lot of necessary drugs. The industry, for understandable reasons, has simply said we're not going to study it, and we're happy to have our label say don't use our drug. But the reality is if you have a person with a disease, they've got to use a drug. There's no other alternative. And we've got to develop ways of studying, realizing that every study we do will have 2 human beings involved, not 1. And then one of my favorite topics is the over 80 crowd, where we know very little. This may relate to my age, I don't know, but I think it's urgent that we get to the bottom of this issue. And then the DTNI, which is in a state of development and evolution, but the nursing school is taking this very seriously. And the issue here is, let's say we have something that we think is effective. We've actually got to implement it in practice. So the question, and this is a key role for nurses, but the Institute, although it's called DTNI, is not eventually meant for nurses only. It's starting there. The issue is, how do you actually implement strategies in practice, in the medical clinic, and in the hospital? And this is an area called implementation research. There's a lot of discussion about it beyond Duke, but I think we're in a good position to take it on. And then DCCR. Before we get to DCCR, just a quick word about site-based research. I notice Mark Stacy is here, who's now the new, I never can remember, Associates, Assistants, and Vices. What's your title? Associate Dean, yeah. So Mark is now heading up this effort from the School of Medicine perspective, but a lot of people have been working on it. And the way I think about it is, as the DCRI evolved, there was a split of functions, where if it's multi-center, it's in the DCRI, or one or two other elements around the School of Medicine that do multi-center research, like the Cancer Center. If it was a single center project done in the Duke Health System, basically it was under the School of Medicine, but it was essentially mom and pop. Each investigator was on his or her own. The personnel were hired by the investigator. There were no standards for job descriptions or qualifications. It just wasn't very well organized. And so now, with a lot of hard work, we've got an organization, and basically this may be a debatable point about enabling versus hindering, but you are not allowed now to submit a protocol to the IRB without the agreement by your site-based research group that you can go ahead and submit. That's a pretty big change. And the goal here is to create a structure where investigators interested in similar problems work together in patient populations. I'll just give you the example that recently happened that brought this home in a positive way for me. As many of you know, I've developed a great interest in diabetes and vascular disease, and we're doing some big global trials. And the question comes up, what about Duke as a site to enroll patients in these trials? And so we set about to do this, and our informatics group has developed an amazing pair of tools called Deduce and Discern, which enable you, totally guided electronically, to, with good confidentiality and good compliance with IRB and everything else, to find out exactly who in the Duke Health System has diabetes and vascular disease. And then it even has a system where if you want to know when an eligible patient is going to come for a clinic appointment, it can page you and say, this person is eligible for a study because they have these characteristics, and they're going to see you in clinic in an hour, or however you want to program it in. It turns out that when we looked at it, lo and behold, we found out that there were at least several other groups also looking at diabetes and vascular disease patients. And then we had a meeting, and I think the total number is something like 17 different groups from different organizational entities at Duke are eyeballing the same patients for different studies. And so we need a system where we're not ambulance chasing for patients for clinical studies, but we're thinking carefully about the most important studies to be done in the best way of doing them. And so, as you might guess, these are breaking down according to medical areas where people are treated in terms of the site-based research group. We just are adding, it's not quite totally final, but cardiovascular has been split out as a separate one under the Heart Center. Okay, so this is DTNI. I've already talked about it. Now, DCCR. I don't have time to talk about everything, so I'm just going to mention the Durham Health Innovations Project because it's really, really red hot right now. Durham, and I'm going to show all old slides because I can't reveal the new information that's not ready for distribution yet. But the basic facts haven't changed. We're a fascinating county because we're so diverse, and we have the highs and lows. We have better than median income for the state of North Carolina, but we also have a higher rate of poverty than the average county in North Carolina, and a tremendous diversity of educational status. We had a heated debate today about exactly where we are relative to North Carolina, and I've changed the slide a little bit to say we're sort of average for North Carolina, although we have more doctors than dentists. Bill Fulkerson's quote on this, by the way, which I loved, was, "Half of our doctors don't practice, so they shouldn't count." It's partially true. But no one could argue with the fact that North Carolina doesn't look good compared to the rest of the U.S. So if we're even better than average for North Carolina, everyone agrees that we could improve substantially. And these are real data. They're not new. These are the old data, but just to show I can pick on my own specialty. Despite Dr. Harrington and Peterson and all these world-famous cardiologists, we have Dr. O'Connor in the crowd. We're only minimally better and not statistically significantly better than the rest of North Carolina, but we have twice as many doctors. Now, with the help of a lot of people, and I've shown these slides before, and I think even at a research conference, we've now taken Durham County, and we've been able to merge the electronic health data with fine-grained geospatial mapping done in the School of the Environment. And as you can see, there's a tremendous variation, for example, in the proportion of African American people by the specific neighborhood that they live in. And this is not a bad thing. If you were in the Northeast, the pattern would look quite different. It would be all dark and all light. Detroit being the prime example that people talk about, where you go essentially 19 miles of almost 100% African American and then 20 miles of almost all Caucasian. So we're heterogeneous, but when you look at detail, we're diverse, but when you look at details by neighborhood, there is segmentation. And just to show that we can use the data, Marilyn Miranda and her group did this work. We can find everyone who's used the Duke Emergency Department, and we can find everyone who's used the rest of the system among people with any diagnosis. And so the point of this is, if you begin to think about health risks not just as a set of biological characteristics, but partly environmental characteristics and cultural characteristics of your neighborhood, we have a tremendous ability to look at this and then devise plans to try to counteract it. Work in progress right now, just mentioned briefly, is using these same methods. I saw Maury Lynn and Gail Harris, the head of our health department today, looking at data about H1N1 vaccination. And you can imagine, if you have a picture of where all the people are who are new cases and where all the vaccinations are occurring, what you'd like to do is to make sure that there's a high rate of vaccination in the neighborhoods where the cases are the highest. And they're working using this sort of technology to do that as we speak. And so we had this first phase of this project. We spent about $1 million in planning. Almost all on salary, split very nicely between the community and Duke. The groups have now completed their first phase of work. They've submitted reports, and we've been editing the reports over the holidays. There's a lot of interesting and somewhat controversial stuff in there, so we're working hard to get consensus, because we don't want to put anything out in the public until the group that's done the work reaches a consensus about it. The 10 areas that were selected are depicted here, and as you might imagine, these range from issues where the Duke health system has a lot of influence, like cardiovascular disease or COPD or cancer screening, to areas where the health system can facilitate but doesn't have a huge influence, like childhood obesity. And so it's been fascinating to look at the plans that people have come up to deal with this. What's been common to all the plans is that we need to revamp the way we think about health as being a system. You can have elements of the system doing a spectacular job, like a heart center with almost perfect metrics, but still have a high rate of mortality from cardiovascular disease in the community. And so the elements of bringing things closer to people so they don't have to travel to clinics, being connected through better information systems, and being accountable, that is measuring things and changing them when they're not working. We have about 1,300 HIV positive people in Durham. The best estimate is that about a third of them are out there without ongoing health care makes you wonder. We have dozens of voluntary organizations trying to work with them, just as one example. So bringing this together in a more coordinated fashion to deliver the services that people need will be likely to make a difference. So stay tuned. The report from the first phase is imminent, and at the Durham Health Summit on March 29th, we'll have a fairly large public unveiling of what we're thinking. And so these are the ongoing efforts of the DCCR, which are very much underway. And I won't have time to go over all of them, but most of this has to do with finishing the job in Durham, which of course will never be finished. It'll be ongoing forever. But a lot of people have taken note of what we're doing, and there are substantial opportunities here to spread this kind of work across the United States, and it's happening. A few quick words about the supporting structures. This slide is way too complicated to talk about. Let's just say I'm still searching for the right way to talk about informatics, but we have a tremendous group of people that are making a big difference. I will mention this one again because I think our grand goal as a group is to make progress in this. So no matter where you are in the Duke system, if you're generating data, it can go into a system where other people can use it to learn. And that's really what I mean by a learning health system. But it's not simply at the level of delivering health care, it's also at the level of scientific investigation. Many hurdles to get over to get there. It's probably longer than a 6-year project, but we'll see how far we get. The biostatistics, epidemiology, and ethics. As you know, we have the new master's program in biostatistics, which is still work in progress. And during this course, I want to have the PhD program up and going. It's a good challenge for Liz to solve. And Danny Benjamin is working to increase the effect he's had in pediatrics with cross-training of people with MDs and masters and PhDs in the quantitative sciences. Our ethics group, I think, has done a pretty amazing job of empirical research that's very helpful, and we want that to continue. One of our biggest successes has been the regulatory support and knowledge group, which has made a huge difference. Outside of academia, it seems strange that when we took over this CTSA grant, there was no record of all of the INDs that Duke investigators had. So whether people were fulfilling their obligations to the FDA or the government was unclear to anyone at that time. So the tremendous effort to get all this organized, and also now to have a very robust consulting service where people are seeking us out for help has been a tremendous advance. And then I won't have time to talk about education and training other than to emphasize again, this is a key area for the DCRI, working with our ongoing CME, with our global reach in terms of clinical trials and other kinds of research studies. We have access to practitioners almost everywhere, and we need to take better advantage of this to help in the educational effort. In the meanwhile, all these other things will be ongoing and fortified so that every kind of investigator has access to the kind of training that's needed. And our main method of evaluation will be saying what we intend to do and then measuring whether what we're doing what we intended. I think even more importantly is if we find that we're off course, changing what we do to get better. And then finally, the Global Health Institute. Just a word about this, and I think this is just a neat picture for the DCRI. This is hot slides today from Mike Merson and John Bartlett. These are the research sites of our Global Health Institute. These are the international educational sites of our Global Health Institute. And there's the DCRI. So if we put these two together, what's in gray here is everywhere the DCRI is working. Green are places where the DCRI is not working. We've got, I would bet 95% of countries have some Duke entity which is either conducting research or providing education. And as I say, this has been a very positive relationship. So the very last thing, what about hot areas that cut across the continuum? I'll only go through one today, but we have openings. So I'm asking you, if you think of a hot area, Fast forward to 6 years from now, what's going to be hot in medicine? Let's try to anticipate what it's going to be and see if we can be leaders in getting there. So if we take the area of stratified medicine and look at the continuum, there's a role for every entity across the spectrum in participating in this. And I want to emphasize again here, a key role here is decision sciences, where Kevin Weinfurt's group is among several key groups on campus that could really make a difference here. And there's a role for every supporting infrastructure organization, not just to support, but to develop new methods that make it possible to get where we want to get with this. We would all love it if we could walk into the doctor's office, or even better yet for people like me, just get an internet message that says, you need to take aspirin today and next week because it'll keep you from having a heart attack. It's easy to envision now that this is possible, that it could be done, but getting there is going to be a tremendous effort. So where are we now with this? As I said, the basic components are written. I think the hard part is actually done. What we have room for now is a lot of input from our external advisory committee and a lot of refining and polishing. But I would add, what should be the most fun now is having people come up with the craziest ideas they can come up with for things that we haven't thought about. Because most places, when they respond to an RFA like this, as you might imagine, are just going to lay out the things that are asked for and say, we'll do a good job with it. If we can come out with some bold things like we did with Durham Health Innovations, it would make it particularly interesting for me. So finally, what can you do? Most importantly, particularly for the DCRI, but every other element, keep doing projects well. In the end, doing projects well is what enables us to make a difference. And I don't want people to lose sight of that. But the suggestion box is open for creative ideas, and in your spare time, if you can think of something that's different, either operationally or scientifically, that would make a difference, let us know. And then sort of the main point of this whole talk is it is going to be a time when we need to get everyone to take sort of a step up and look outside of your specific environment and ask the question, how can we improve the ability that we have to work together across these different entities? But don't do it so much that you get distracted from issue number one, doing the projects well. So I appreciate your attention and hope this has been helpful in giving you a picture of where we're heading.
Rob, thank you so much. Words of inspiration for all of us. I know that the hour is late. Bob, I'll give you an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment, perhaps.
Rob, that obviously, not surprisingly, was a tremendous overview of what your thoughts are for the next few years. You touched on, but you didn't directly address within your CTSA plans, better integration with the health system. Or maybe I missed it, other than to say it's a challenge. What are we going to do? I met with a chair candidate this morning for one of the major departments, and his lament after meeting with the dean was that there's no sense of connectivity between the academic mission of the school and the goals of the health system. Is this just a chair candidate missing the boat, or is this something that we can address through the CTSA? Just quickly answer that.
I would say it differently. I think we have a gap in execution. I don't think that people that are running, in fact, I know that people running the Duke Health system have the same goal, but people are very distracted by the business issues of the day, and it's very hard to create the connections. I might add partly because the financial systems that we live in purposefully make it hard to connect the dots, in my view. And although I know Dr. O'Connor and his Republicans are working hard to defeat the health reform, I'm lamenting the fact that essentially there's not going to be a change in payment system, and that's going to make it hard because basically the health system gets paid for repetitively doing expensive things that generate a margin. And if you slow that down with fuzzy-headed academics, it's a problem. and it cuts a margin that comes back to the academic enterprise. But I can assure you, one reason, just to be totally candid, a lot of people know this, the reason I put 6 years is that this is, 6 years from now I'll be almost 65. This is kind of my last shot. I don't intend to sort of ride this out to retirement. I think we've got to amass the troops now. I think Durham Health Innovations, we've got 1,000 people in Durham who are very well schooled in what the issues are. And there are no villains here that I can find. I think there are people that are struggling to do their jobs and want to make this work. But, when I get down here, I go to other places and I ask the question, who's doing it better with this mission? It's hard to find. Certainly find places that are better integrated in health systems. And you find places that have bigger basic science portfolios. I don't find places that are fulfilling the triple mission better. That's why I say we get a C+, but the rest of the field, I don't know.
Well, I think with that, Rob, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us today.